Good evening to everyone that is joining us for tonight's Hot Topic conversation. For those of you who have not been able to join us over the last couple of weeks, we've been highlighting some of our episodes from 2020, stuff that really stood out. And so if there's stuff that you missed out, this is a great opportunity to catch up on some of the episodes we managed to cover in 2020. And this week, we're going to be looking at the How Far is Too Far series. In the first episode, we looked at party culture. How far is too far as far as party culture is concerned? For this conversation, we invited Mitch and Sia to join us as we unpack this whole conversation on what it means to be a Christian in party spaces.
I think this is really such an interesting topic because sometimes it's like one of those things that everyone's doing it, nobody's talking about it, and we don't necessarily understand some of the implications either way. If we do it, we don't do it, we don't engage the party space, we do engage, we don't quite understand what does that look like and what does it mean for us.
And I think for a lot of Christians, the question is always, can I party, should I not party? Or in fact, even more, when I am in party spaces, what can I do and cannot do? So, man, I know people have had funny ideas on what it means to be a Christian in party spaces. For some people, it means that for the entire night, you're going to be drinking water. For some Christians, it means that for the whole night, you're going to be sitting at a place at some random chair, and you're just going to be reading a Bible, waiting for people who need to be saved, and all of that. And so in this conversation, we unpack what it means to be a normal person and yet be in a party space without compromising your Christian values. And this is something that C.S. speaks about. He says, when we go into party spaces, we cannot conform. When we go into party spaces, we need to be clear on our values. But then Mitch then goes on to speak about this idea of being in a party space and acknowledging that you are not perfect, that we are all in a process. We are discovering our identity. And once we've discovered, whatever we've discovered of our identity should not be lost because of the space we find ourselves in. Do check this episode out.
Well, I'm a young conservative Christian, and there's no questions about where my values lie, about how Christians ought to celebrate. And, the issues of values and morals are very personal, and I understand that when we gather in church, we are our own individual self, coming from different homes with different value systems. But something joins us together as Christians, and that is our values and ethics and morals, which is very important. And society ought to look at us at a very different light as Christians. We ought to be agents of social change. There must be a difference when you come to a room. There must, even in a party, when you go to a party, there must be a difference. So people must be able to draw inspiration from you. I find it very problematic when Christians are in a space and they're able to assimilate in the space. Their morals are left at home, and they are now becoming a part of society that they advocate against on a Sunday morning, right? So it's very hypocritical. So without bordering the spaces around whether we should be drinking alcohol or not, which I would obviously say we shouldn't, but that's not the topic of discussion today. But the party scene is a very important scene that I think we need to unpack, and where a Christian body finds themselves in, right? So it is a space as a Christian where I feel unsafe, number one. It is a space that I ought to be uncomfortable. It is a space that is very foreign to me. So it becomes very weird when a Christian body is in a party scene, and it is something that they don't advocate for, right? So there's drugs around, there's fornication around, there's touching, hopefully not during COVID. But these are things that exist. And so a party for a Christian ought to be something different that the world sees as a party scene. So if I'm in a party and there's Christians around, that should show. And so that's another conversation we need to have, where there's just Christians in the room, but you wouldn't think this is a party of Christians. And we've seen it over and over again. And so I have a problem with people volunteering their lives into a religion, into a church. So I'm Methodist, so into the Methodist church. And then at the same time, wanting to continue with things that are outside of the church and outside of the religion. So it's a double standard, double sword thing. And so for me, Christianity, Methodism must be expressed. You must live it on a daily basis. People must see it on a daily basis at work. People must see it when you drive, your road rage, in shops, how you deal with issues of racism, sexism, xenophobia, and all of that. So parties are central to that because they're social circles, right? And this is where we interact. So it becomes very hypocritical when a Christian body is seen to perpetuate that which is against its Christian values, and specifically Methodism. And our church is very clear, how we should live our lives, whether we should drink alcohol or not, whether we should do certain things at certain times. And so it becomes very hypocritical. Unless the dogma and the policy of the church changes, then the current status quo exists. You have volunteered to be a Methodist and live a life of Methodism. Otherwise, you're then putting the church to disrepute. And that's where I stand, and I'm very clear on that, right? So the issue then becomes, I am invited to a wedding, and the wedding turns rogue, right? That's nothing I can control. So, and I find myself in many instances, I've been invited and I've been asked to MC and preside over instances and events where it gets out of hand, right? But Sianda comes across. Sianda, the Christian young man, comes across. I mean, I'm one person in a wedding. When I a program director for a wedding, I'll excuse myself when the toast arrives because alcohol is involved and I don't understand the principle, so I excuse myself. So you see, I am in the space, I am socializing, I am one with the people, but my Christian values come through, and I think that's very important.
Thanks for that, Sianda.
Yeah, I love, I really love the ethic behind what you're saying. What I'm hearing from you is that Christians are given a glorious identity, and I believe that as Christians, it's not our doing that dictates our being, but it's our being that dictates our doing. Sure. It's who we are, which leads to what we do. And so we are redeemed people who are in this process of sanctification, this process of becoming who Jesus has made us into already. And so I think that obviously means the pursuit of holiness, which is a high calling. I think a lot of Christians really underestimate what it means to be called God's holy people. I think it's a privilege because right now we aren't, and I think we can all be aware of the fact that no matter how hard we try this side of eternity, holiness is something we'll always fall short of. Yet, we're still called holy, right? And so part of holiness is pursuing this Christian ethic, these Christian morals, which Jesus perfectly embodied. But the other part of being holiness is also imaging the side of Jesus who left his throne behind to enter into a broken space, to be an agent of transformation and change in that space. And so when Jesus was on earth, we find him in party spaces quite regularly. And that's one of the things I love about Jesus so much, is that Jesus didn't come to earth to point a finger from a distance, but Jesus came to earth to change from within. And one of my favorite stories in the Bible, well, it's actually a succession of stories, but it comes from Luke chapter 15, where we hear the three parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, and then the prodigal son. But those three stories are precipitated by a question asked by the Pharisees, actually an accusation made by the Pharisees, that why do you spend all your time with sinners and tax collectors? And so then Jesus tells the story about when someone goes missing, when something precious goes missing, we seek after it with all of our zeal. We seek after it with everything we have. And when we have the privilege of discovering it and bringing it back, we celebrate, right? So the prodigal son ends with a party, right? And I truly believe that we are going to be entering into heaven one day, into our glorious future promised reality, with a party. And so what I believe is that our job as Christians is to bring that reality as much as we can into the present now. How can we party in a way here that communicates to a world what is awaiting them in heaven should they come to Jesus? And that involves everything that you're saying. We party, but we do it in a sanctified way. We celebrate because we have the most to celebrate in the world, but we do it in a way that is countercultural. so that as potential non-believers or not yet believers look in on the way that we party and think, yo, this is still fun. In fact, this is better, you know? And we do it without drinking. We do it without drugs. We do it without what you were saying, fornication and that stuff. And yet, I still think we should be more fun, if you know what I'm saying. Because of the truths that we're celebrating, they are more worth celebrating than, as awesome as finishing matric is, Jesus saving me from sin and death is cooler, you know? And I think that that's worth celebrating. And so I believe that we as Christians should be people who celebrate, but celebrate in a sanctified way that creates a wonderful witness for people to look into.
Amazing, right? To even more importantly, hear young Christians speak about what it means to be in a party space without compromising your values. Some important stuff for us to apply in our own lives.
So another one of the topics that we looked at as part of this series was weed. And that was actually very interesting for me as well. It's because often we've only heard people speak about weed from the perspective of being a drug, not necessarily as a substance that could be used for other things, medicinally, and a whole range of different things. We just speak about it as a drug and we don't engage the conversation any further.
Now, I'm a 90s kid. The minute you speak about weed, the first thing that comes into mind is Afro Man. I was going to pay my rent, but then I got high. But in that song, he also kind of speaks about how weed has killed his motivation to do various things. And it's something that Christine also touches on, that it kills the motivation to do important stuff, you know, but that's what it means for some people.
Yeah. And Christine also highlights important aspects about this that's so nuanced, like the financial impact and the also the societal implications of weed. How we find ourselves maybe at a place where we can't function, or some people that function better when they actually are on weed. And so what we had our guests also engaging is the idea, what does it mean to look at it as a substance, as part of the creation narrative, and not just the way that we've shaped it and molded it to be as humans, and that's to say a drug, but what do we look at it as part of within the creation narrative, as a substance created by God that was declared good when it was created. And so let's have a look at what our guests had to say in this episode about the topic of weed.
Are there other things that we could explore in engaging that? Because, for instance, the first thing that usually comes into mind is that within African systems of knowledge, there is always this idea that there are things that your family does not engage in, because it is known that in your family it does other stuff. And I suppose we've got that comes from the benefit of having a strong sense of community and being able to trace and locate everyone. Is there anything like that we can explore? But let me just, in that order.
Okay, so I'm glad you mentioned the economic framework, because this is what, and maybe this is something that is worth considering, is who is benefiting from the legalization of cannabis. Was there proper engagement with the positive, negative outcomes, the actual social outcomes of cannabis before it was legalized? And my concern is when they put through that constitutional legislation, there was not enough expertise on the panel. So there was the people that were advocating for the legalization, and they're making a huge amount of money from the selling and the growing of cannabis. So we've got to think a little bit more broader than this is actually an economic company or an economic benefit for a number of people that are not necessarily vulnerable to the negative outcomes. So they've been smoking cannabis for however long, and then they saw that it's a lovely economic enterprise for them to formalize it and to make a lot of money from it, a lot of money from the legalization. So they obviously pulled in constitutional rights to individual choice, and so this bill was passed with that kind of lobby behind it, but nobody wants to talk about that lobby. The people that are making money from cannabis being legalized. And I'm not talking about the grower in the Eastern Cape that sells it on the unofficial informal market. I'm talking about the official market where you can now literally walk into certain, kind of stores and they say, here's this product with cannabis in it and this product. I'm talking about the formal market. Those people are the commercialization of cannabis. that was passed from a particular lobby, and that lobby was not also, there wasn't a lobby saying, but what is the medical implications or the psychiatric fallout for vulnerable people? And that's my issue. Also with the legalization, there wasn't enough stakeholders, sufficient stakeholders to say, hold on a second, we are going to lose a percentage of our young population to this drug. If we look at it internationally, we've got developed countries like the Netherlands that are worried that a significant proportion of their young adults are not ever going to be able to function in society. Rather, they're now having to build psychiatric facilities for them to survive. And that is a problem, whereas that was not explored in the lobbies that happened around the constitutional legalization of that. So there was not enough stakeholder involvement, or should I say varied stakeholder involvement. But rather the people that were very familiar with individual rights were quick to say, let's just legalize it. And so that's my biggest concern. Yeah.
Yeah, I think, Sean, I think the most critical thing with what you call African indigenous knowledge is that obviously it's passed from generation to generation. And we all know that some of it is not really written or even scientific proven in the way we understand science today. So it is very difficult to know. Our grandparents in the olden days, they will die without being even diagnosed what exactly killed them. It could be witchcraft, it could be many things that it was happening in that particular community. But as I've said right from the beginning, that from the African perspective, when you look at cannabis, dacha, and whatever you call it, it is not just a drug. I want to emphasize that. It is not just smoked, it's when you have certain flus, you boil it with water, you drink it, you don't get hallucination or something like that. So from that perspective, and also from the biblical perspective, I'll make an example with aloe. Aloe is very critical for Africans. Every home must have aloe. Now you are buying it. It's very expensive. You buy water now for about 30 rand, something that you could have just got it from your garden, boil it, So there are things that I think we need as the society, particularly those who are doing research, to be kind of consistent in discovering some of the things that are happening throughout the world, in our communities as well, and be able to ask ourselves a question: how do we reintroduce, so that the part of education to our young people, it's not one-sided. It's not that just a drug that you smoke, that you get addicted, and therefore it can cause you cancer, it can cause you a mental breakdown, and but also how it's been used before, as how communities used it before. How come it was not dangerous to use it before, and why it's been now manipulated? Because that's what I was going to say as my closing, that unfortunately everything that we live with, that God created us to live with, whether it's animals, you hear rhino poaching, people they manipulate for their own capitalist advancements, their own financial advancements. So what the doc is saying is that if the debate is going to be about money, we are not going to win, because clearly anything that is pushed from the financial advancement point of view, it get passed, because as she's saying that there are people who are gaining out of it.
Wasn't that an interesting conversation? Maybe you explored it from a different angle that you've never thought about it before, but here's another episode that is definitely going to blow your mind.
how far is too far? Now, we're not just speaking about how far is too far when it comes to drinking in this episode. We mean how far is too far when it comes to cuddles? Does it end with a handshake between unmarried couples? Or does it move on to cuddles? Does it stop when they start looking at each other? Or can they go all the way? You know, how far is too far? And for this particular conversation, one of the things we look at is the challenges that young people are faced with, particularly young people, because this is usually at the center of their faith formation journey as unmarried people with biological reality. So we'll look at the tension, this difficult space that they have to hold between their biological developments and their ethics, the ethics they are called to live by as young Christians who are called to abstain from sex outside of marriage. Can they help themselves through other means, or can they go all the way and engage sexually, or do they have to stop at a certain place?
And what was so interesting about this conversation as well is sometimes we like to have some rules and some guidelines as Christians to say you can go up to the first base, the second base, the third base, but where in reality it's not so easy. You can't draw a line in the sand and say up to here, or can you? You know, but is it helpful to give people a set of rules to abide by, or do we teach in a way that actually engages not just the mind and the body, but also the heart and the spirit?
And Anele, in actual fact, speaking about what the church does, he then goes on to ask Prof an important question. Why does the church have to regulate pleasure and desire and pleasure? But Prof then gives us something that is very helpful around this to help us understand that in the call for people to abstain from sex outside of marriage, there is a desire to protect people. In the church saying, do not watch certain content and do not employ certain things that are recommended by the world for people who do not want to engage sexually. There is a desire to protect us because this has an implication on our development and the kind of people we become. So check this conversation out, also with Anele asking Prof some very important questions around how far is too far.
From his earliest, Sigmund Freud writes about psychosocial stage of development. He says, a baby, from an earliest infant stage, they can make sense of these vibrations and sensations. But when they grow later, they begin to make sense and give it a name when they know what to do with what they have. But it's a primitive thing that an infant, at certain stages, they would play with their genitalia. They get pleasure out of that. But it's not sexual pleasure. So if that is a natural process of life, psychologically and otherwise, why at the end then church is going to say sex before marriage is sin? How desire and pleasure become sin?
It's a big issue because it's exactly, you are so right. I mean, we have made being sexual human beings sound dirty. And make a lot of our young people feel guilty for just having those desires, let alone acting it out. So we have made a lot of mistakes, and it comes from history, which is not on the table today. But the issue of what we need to talk about is that at about 11, 12, 13 years, something happens in my body that takes over a whole new dimension of becoming the person I want to be and eventually will be. And it is not about having those desires. That's no sin. It is about living responsibly with your desires. And in that sense, the church has come to the point and said there is a safe way of living them out freely, and a stable relationship is probably the safest way to do that. So the procreation thing is not the only dimension of it. It is a pleasure thing too. And we should be open.
Why is this pleasure governed? That there must be marriage for this pleasure?
No. That's not what I say. But the safest way of keeping that desire controlled for the benefit of others and the benefit of myself, there is a safe space necessary for that. And that in history happened through marriage. I've read in a previous discussion Rabbi Akiba who said, happy and lucky is the man who can give his daughter at 13 into marriage because he protects her from unchaste life, and even stronger, he kept her from being a prostitute. So that's an Old Testament understanding of the safety of the space for that ultimate coitus, the ultimate of our sexuality, is to become one with another human being, a man and a wife in our discussion normally, but not necessarily. So it is control of my desires. It is not making my desire sinful. And that's what we've done to young people. We've made them feel guilty.
Now, that was an amazing conversation. But if you thought that was the most taboo topic we could engage in as the hot topics conversation, man, you missed out, because this is about to blow your mind.
This was definitely one of my favorite episodes of this series. You know, cohabitation. What does this mean for Christians? Can we live together? Can we not live together without being married? I thought this would be, honestly, quite a simple and straightforward conversation when we first decided we were going to speak about this. I thought there'd be very clear guidelines and very clear points where the people of the church would say this and this and this. And actually, I found it such an interesting topic because it's so complex. There's definitely parts that I never thought about that are so important in the conversation that we never actually think about. We think about it as a set of rules to say the church says don't have sex before marriage, don't do this, don't do that. But we don't think about some stuff like the socioeconomic factors that are also involved in this topic.
And what Prof does for us in this particular conversation, Ilse, is helps us understand that that the rituals behind marriage are not necessarily what consummates a marriage. And so even what we define as cohabitation may not necessarily be cohabitation. And at times we might have wrongfully condemned people and made them feel as though they are living a life of sin, a life that is just a curse to society, whereas people are honestly trying to find their feet, and at times people have decided to express their marriage in a way that is very different to what we understand marriage to be.
And another thing that I picked up in the episode on the topic of marriage is that cohabitation is not always actually just about getting married. Sometimes there is no intention in marriage. And one thing that really stood out for me in this episode and speaking to people afterwards is there is a call from the people of the church, the congregation, those of us that call ourselves Christians, for the church to have an updated or culturally updated conversation on this topic. And so let's have a look at what our panel and our guests had to say about this topic. I think you guys have touched on something big there. You know, and the message that comes through for me is there's a sense that culture informs how we define marriage, but we cannot define marriage without culture, but we cannot allow culture exclusively only to define marriage. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, it makes a lot of sense.
You know, Prof, what do you think?
There are many reasons why people cohabitate, and some of them are better than others, and some are just plain bad. Why? I mean, the whole thing of sleeping around is part of it, and the convenience thing that you can pop out anytime you want to. And then there are a number of people who are experimenting with marriage. So if we do not help our young people to discover the deep meaning of what sharing life, that's what marriage is all about. It's sharing life and sharing it with a commitment to share it, to continue to share it. And that's the beauty of being married. So as Christians, we can never give up on that. It is how we support our young people to make good ethical choices on the way to that commitment. And that commitment comes in our time somewhere 25 through 35. When I was a young pastor, it was between 20 and 21. I can read you a quote now from one of the best known rabbis in the Jewish tradition that said, "Happy is the man that can give out his daughter, a bogaret, at the age of 13 to get married." That's what happened. It was an arranged thing. And the reason, I can read it from this book, is that you keep her from prostitution, from living an unjust, say that again in Afrikaans, an onrein lewe te leef. You can keep her from living a dirty life. So marriage has safety in it. And just one last remark, I feel guilty that we do not support our young people on this road, because they now become ready for sex, not ready for marriage. They become ready for sex at age 12, 13, 14. They only get married, say, 28.
Yes.
What do we do in the meantime? Do we really show them Christian love and support?
I think it's the
helping
approach.
them.
It's definitely the approach, especially from the elders and the older people in the church, and how they approach certain topics, especially around the whole sex before marriage and everything. Because you, as a young person, I don't want to feel condemned for a lot of things.
Yeah.
So now, if your approach, I feel like you're condemning me in a very harsh manner,
Yeah.
it starts making me look at God in another light. You tell me,
Yeah.
okay, God is a forgiving God, and
Yeah.
but then the way you speak, or rather the way you try and advise me as a young person, doesn't show that love of God that you speak so
Absolutely.
highly about.
Absolutely. And I mean, just before you answer, Hloni, just think of Jesus and the woman at the well in John 3. She was living with a number 6. And because why? There was a law that she's not allowed to marry him.
Yes.
So she was cohabitating because of certain law in her culture, but he never condemned her, but he did invite her. I can quench your thirst in a way that you don't even know how complete it will
yes,
be. And then
yes.
your life changes. You make
Yes.
different choices. So that deep relationship with the Lord Jesus himself encourages and makes it possible to make better choices in life. Because there are certainly people living together which we would call as Christians sinful.
Absolutely.
But we cannot throw a blanket over all of them and say, there has to be pastoral care. Why are you doing this? Why are you afraid for that covenantal commitment?
Wow. What an interesting topic, right? So we really hope that you've enjoyed this topic and this episode as we've looked at our How Far is Too Far series. It's definitely one of the coolest conversations we've had as we've looked at these topics and really just engaged what does it mean to be a Christian in the real life? Not just as someone sitting reading my Bible all day, but as a Christian, how do I go and navigate my life as we go? And so if you want to have a look at the episodes, maybe you want to watch the full episode after watching a little piece of it, they are up on YouTube, they're on Facebook, they're on our page. Please do go have a look at it.
And hey, as always, remember to like, share, and recommend. It's very helpful, man. We're all trying to grow this. We want more people to hear about this. Do take care. We look forward to connecting with you. And even if you have topic suggestions or questions, please feel free to pop it in the comment section or DM us on any of our platforms.
So we'll see you again next week for the last part of our Best of 2020 review series.